very, very much. Well, I was delighted by your introduction. I'm just very pleased. Actually, I thought it was I who would be still in the Minneapolis airport. I approached Des Moines, I guess, at 3:15 this afternoon. I was about 15 minutes out of the city, and they told us we had to go back to Minneapolis because there was some part missing that they couldn't find in Des Moines. It never made sense to me, but anyway, we landed in Minneapolis, and then they told us they were canceling that flight, and then the next airline I got on delayed that flight, so I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to begin tonight to put myself at ease after this rather pressured day. I would like to begin by taking you along the path that brought me here. I don't mean the path through Minneapolis. I mean a trajectory that began in the 1960s, well, long before that, but it's only one night I have with you, so I'll begin in the 60s, because in many ways I am a classic product of that era. I graduated from college in 1966, from a small Midwestern school, Earlham College in Indiana. And like so many young people, I was in deep distress about the war in Vietnam. I was in deep distress about the struggle for civil rights, very anguished young person, and felt that if I didn't solve America's problems immediately, if I didn't make some impact soon, that everything that I'd grown up believing about my country would be lost. And so I ended up in community organizing work in Philadelphia. And I worked with people who I believed were hurting the most in America. People who were trying to make it on welfare and trying to feed their kids and keep their kids from freezing at night. And my job was to try to be somewhat of an advocate to make sure that they got what they were entitled to under our laws and to help organize a welfare rights movement. But each day when I would come home, instead of becoming less desperate, I became more desperate. Instead of having more answers, I had fewer answers. I didn't understand how what I was doing related to the causes of the suffering that was more and more evident to me every day. But I went on doing what I was doing because I didn't know what else to do. Until this was 1967, and the woman that I worked most closely with died of a heart attack, younger than I am now, in her early 40s. And I was convinced that Lily died of poverty, but I didn't know how what I was doing addressed the causes of her death. But as I say, I still went on doing what I was doing because I didn't know how to address the causes of Lily's death. I ended up in a graduate program in community organizing at the University of California at Berkeley. And then in the spring of 1969, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I decided that I would stop. I would stop doing anything to try to save the world until I understood how what I was doing related to the underlying causes of the suffering that was so obviously needless. And I was absolutely terrified that somebody would ask me what I was doing and I didn't have an answer. Because I wasn't a social worker anymore. I wasn't in a social work program. I didn't have any kids then, so I couldn't really call myself a homemaker. So what was I? In my terror, I decided that I should stay home a lot and avoid any questions. And of course, people tease me now and they say, "Are you kidding?" In the late 60s, in Berkeley, California, who would have asked you, "What are you doing?" People might have asked you, "What are you into?" But I couldn't answer that either. So what happened is that this decision to retreat turned into a very unexpected set of benefits. For the first time in my life, I started listening. You see, I had grown up in the South in the 50s, in a football culture where girls were supposed to be pretty and not very smart. And so when I left Texas to go to college, I was in a state of fear that I would be discovered by, of course, I knew that everybody outside the border of Texas was an Eastern intellectual. And so when I went through college, I tried to trick my professors into not discovering that I was really the dumb Southern female that I knew that I was. And so when you go through college trying to trick your professors, you don't learn a great deal. You certainly don't listen. What I mean by listening is that then in '69, when I made the decision, I started listening to questions that were coming from inside me. I didn't know I had any questions. I always thought it was professors' questions or somebody else's questions. And I started listening and realized that there were those that I had to answer before I could take the next steps in my life. And of course, this was the era of the birth of the ecology movement and the notion of limits to growth. And so I set out for myself to discover just how close are we to the Earth's limits. And I found a hideaway where no one would bother me, almost as safe as my home. It turned out to be a vacant, almost vacant spot on the University of California, Berkeley campus. It was the agriculture library. And I found a friendly librarian who helped me develop the research technique, which I swear by and have developed over these years. And I call it following my nose. What I mean by that is I didn't know exactly where I was headed. I just knew that I had questions that I had to answer. And so one question led to another question. How close are we to the Earth's limits? Is this really the cause of the hunger that we see throughout the world? And I began in this modest study of my own, pursuing question after question, one question leading to another, began to realize the reality in the world is sufficiency. And that indeed, I was part of an agriculture and food system in my own country that had taken tremendous abundance, that tremendous, unprecedented, in fact, unparalleled potential in the world, and turned it in many ways into a disposal system, what I began to see as the livestock production system in the United States as a protein disposal system instead of a protein production system, because it took tremendous nutrients that are available to us in plants and transformed them into a much smaller quantity available to us in meat. And so this was, the light bulbs began to go on, and I thought, wait a minute. The problem is what we human beings do with the resources that we have, not the limits of the resources themselves. It was the first step, the first small step. It started as a one-page handout that then became Diet for a Small Planet, because I wanted to convey this message to others. My one-page handout, well, I decided I should really know a little more about it, and the one-page handout eventually became a manuscript that got into the hands of Ballantine Books in 1970. When Diet for a Small Planet came out in 1971, the strangest thing happened. Suddenly, I became, quote-unquote, the Julia Child of the soybean circuit. Now, what I had wanted to do was to clarify the economic and political roots of world hunger. But what happened to me was that I was invited on innumerable TV talk shows, literally to stir the beans and rice on camera and tell people how they can lose weight and save money on the coming world food crisis. Well, it wasn't exactly, you see, what I had in mind. But what does one do? Take what life offers. And so I walked into these opportunities, and I learned, of course, the lesson that is captured as I describe it in the 10th anniversary edition of Diet for a Small Planet, one night in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when I was the only other guest on the show that night. The only other guest with me on the show that night was a UFO expert. So the only question I got was, Ms. LePay, what do you think they eat on UFOs? Now, I learned how to answer a question like that. I learned how to stir beans and rice, all while explaining the political economic roots of world hunger. Fortunately, that era of my life ended in 1974. In 1974 was the World Food Conference. The first major international conflab, sort of world hunger, hit the international marquee, and Henry Kissinger and Earl Butz and others, government corporate leaders, gathered in Rome in November of '74 to draw up a blueprint for how to end world hunger. And I flew off to Rome, thinking, as I look back, still thinking a bit, at least, that I would rub elbows with the real experts, those people who had the answers. I went to Rome in '74, and didn't expect that I would fly back from Rome in such an altered condition. Because what happened is that I realized that those people up there, so to speak, schooled in the institutions of power, were not able to ask the square one questions that could lead to effective diagnosis and solutions. In fact, their diagnoses were taking us backward, not forward, in ending hunger. And it was one of those moments, both terrifying and exhilarating, when it suddenly sinks in that, my God, if those people up there who are supposed to be taking care of business, if they're not, what does that mean? It means, if not I, who? Us. It comes down to each of us. So it was both terrifying, but it was also exhilarating, because I was determined not to be put into the cookbook writer slot. I was determined to rewrite Diet for a Small Planet for the first rewrite, to make its message much more sharp, clear. And I was willing then to take on the much, much more enormous challenge of establishing the Institute for Food and Development Policy, Food First. So at least I've gotten you up to 1974. And so the rest I think I will be explaining in the heart of my talk here. But let me go back to that meeting, the World Food Conference, and describe just for a moment what were the diagnoses that I found so faulty, that still are those presented in so much of popular and general literature on the question of hunger and the popular understanding. I think the diagnoses are basically two. First is a very simple and easily graspable, intuitively correct notion that hunger is really an equation that's gotten out of balance. That's the problem. It is an equation that on the one side you can visualize it as scales. Maybe over here there are numbers of people to feed, hungry mouths, and over here are productive resources. And so if one sees the problem of hunger basically as an equation out of balance, then the solution comes to us very clearly. Yes, we must reduce the number over here of mouths to feed, and we must increase the productive capacities over here, and then, voila, we will have a solution. Now, in our work at the Institute for Food and Development Policy, what we have done in a number of books, and I'll just mention a couple of them here, and many, many other types of materials, what we've tried to do is to look very, very carefully at each side of this equation. And let me take this side first, the too many mouths. Rachel Sherman and I, 2 years ago, completed a small volume called Taking Population Seriously. Our attempt there was to get beyond the misunderstanding. Some people have read Food First and thought that we didn't take population seriously, no matter how many times we iterated and reiterated. So what we did in Taking Population Seriously was to make our position clear and to look at this side of the equation by asking, okay, where have been the success stories? What third world countries have been most dramatically successful? In fact, more successful in reducing birth rates than the now industrial world was during its demographic transition. There are only a handful of such countries, and we chose also not just a country, but one state, the Indian state of Kerala, because of it's such an anomaly within India and such an important, illustrative story. So these are very diverse societies in one sense. I mean, as different as China and Sri Lanka, Costa Rica and Cuba. And Kerala, though, I want to underline. But let me say that what we discovered looking at the lessons that can be learned by the most dramatic success stories is that indeed the solution doesn't come simply from an all-out attack. How do we reduce the number of mouths to feed through birth control? But what we discovered was that what these success stories shared were changes, society-wide changes that opened opportunity and provided security, particularly for women, that the most consistent correlation is between the empowerment of women measured perhaps by literacy rates, I think that's probably a pretty good one, and lowered birth rates. So what we began to see then is reflected most dramatically in the state of Kerala, small, very, very poor state in southern India, where the lowering, the rise in literacy rates for women, the redistribution of land, much more effective than the rest of India, gave people much more security. Old age pensions, even for farm workers, certainly gave people more security. Many more women working outside of the home. Much more education for women and libraries into the countryside. A whole array of changes that also meant infant death rate is half what it is in all India. And this then correlates with the most dramatic drop in birth rate and a success that is, again, an anomaly in the whole rest of the country. So what I'm suggesting is that we looked at this simple equation, mouths over here and productive resources over here, and we said, wait a minute. What was going on, the success stories were telling us that what was happening that allowed birth rates to be reduced was that basic security, including greater access to food, and this is certainly the case in Kerala, where the ration system of subsidized grain is equivalent to about a fifth of people's annual income, gives people a food security that is very real. So what we began to see is that rather than first you reduce births and then you eliminate hunger, that we began to see that first the causes of hunger were being eliminated, people had greater security, greater opportunity, and birth rates fell very dramatically. This is the thesis then of taking population seriously. Now, on the other side of the equation, we have looked carefully at two parts of it. Let me take a sip here. The other side of the equation is a productive resource side. It has two parts. One, you grow more, or you shift food from one side of the globe to another. And in some way or other, you increase the availability of food. This is the obvious way of writing this balance, where there's not enough on one side of the scale. So much of our work in books like Food First and World Hunger 12 Myths, we have asked, is a focus on production a realistic way to end hunger? Does it stand up in the face of reality? And what we have discovered is that indeed one can succeed very dramatically, as Southeast Asia has shown, in increasing production, increasing productivity, certainly. And yet you can have, what we've found is you can have more food and yet more hunger. How can this be? Because a narrow focus on production ends up rewarding those already in a position to take advantage of that new technology, expanding at the expense of those less well-positioned. And so you can have the phenomenon of an India, for example, which has been an exporter of food in various years, and yet estimates are as high from 1/3 to 1/2 of the population still does not have adequate nutrition. And you can have statistics telling you that, UN statistics telling you that during the 1980s there were periods in which we were seeing the pictures of people starving in Africa as the new hunger continent, and yet more people were dying from hunger and hunger-related diseases in India and Pakistan than in the whole continent of Africa. So we began to see that a narrow focus on production was not adequate to eliminate hunger. Now, what about shifting food from one side of the globe to another, the food aid solution? In our book, Betraying the National Interest, in our book, Aid as Obstacle, we try to outline several of the problems with the food aid solution. And I can't do justice to those arguments tonight. I can just mention, of course, which many of you are already aware, I'm sure, is that the 90% of our aid, this is something that I think most Americans do not know about food aid, that only 10% of it is in the form of emergency relief. The rest of it is very closely tied to U.S. Foreign policy goals in such a way that about 60% or more in a given year goes under Title I, and much of that is sold by the recipient government, sold to those in a position to buy it, sold to those who the government, city dwellers, military, and civil servants, the government wants to keep on its side. So The problem with food aid as a solution, fundamentally, is that it presumes that the resources are not there locally. They must be shipped in from outside. And certainly if you look at a country like Bangladesh, you think, well, of course this is true. Now, Bangladesh has a population of over 100 million people in an area the size of Wisconsin. And so you would think that of all the countries, this must, and of course it is a major food aid recipient, it must be one in which it is desperately needed to keep people alive. And yet, many studies have shown that despite that intense population density, which is overpopulated on many, many, many grounds, just in terms of how most of us would want to live and the protection of the natural environment. Yet, strictly from the standpoint of producing food, many studies have suggested that Bangladesh could well feed itself, in fact, be a food exporter. Again, there is not the physical limitations, rather the social, not the physical limitations of the land and water. So I'm back here at the equation that is out of balance. And we looked at the population side and saw that causation turned upside down, that it was as people gained greater security that indeed they were able to lower their birth rates. And on the production side, we saw that a narrow focus on production could in fact lead to greater production and greater productivity and yet more hunger. And so I'm suggesting then that whenever it is that one's simple intuitive diagnoses don't hold up, it's time to go back to the drawing board. It's time to begin to think again about what are the causes of world hunger. Now, there is another piece to the diagnosis that wasn't presented in Rome in 1974 in the way that it has been since then. So I want to spend just a moment. This is certainly the person in the street interpretation of the problem. Beginning in the 1980s and of course continuing today, Washington has presented to us a very clear sense of its diagnosis and therefore Washington policy, or foreign policy in regard to development. And because Ronald Reagan stated it so clearly, I'd like to quote him, because I think it is the dominant view that we do know what the answer to development in the third world is. As Reagan put it, we already know what works: private ownership, the freedom to innovate, healthy competition, reliance on market forces, and faith in the strength and inventiveness of the individual citizen. Privatization is premised on all of these principles and offers us the surest road to economic renewal for families and nations. So through the 1980s and up to today, then, the buzzword is privatization. As we know, the magic of the market is not simply didn't go out with the end of the Reagan administration. It is now that the idea that development and the magic of the market are synonymous. And so, again, I think the formulae that have an intuitive appeal and have truth in them, of course, because back to the simple equation, of course you have to grow food to be able to eat it. So it's not that there isn't truth in this equation. It's simply when we take it and don't apply it in the real world setting. Now, what happened during the 1980s when the Reagan administration presumed that it had the answer, as Reagan said? Of course, what that implies then, the privatization theme song, is that, as we've seen here in our own country applied, that all government is bad and the market is all good. The government is non-productive and the private sector is productive. So let's stop emphasizing in any sense backing any sort of government investments. Let's let the market have its way. Now, there are several problems here. Certainly, it sounds good until you experience as we have here close to home, you experience the S&L crisis, or I kept thinking, and I was wandering around the Minneapolis airport today when this strange situation that they couldn't land in Des Moines to get this thing fixed. I wondered, what am I paying the price for airline deregulation and the dogma, the anti-government dogma of the Reagan years? But nevertheless, it has an appeal. Now, what are the particular drawbacks as we think of the third world? Well, I was struck by a World Bank study that directly addressed the Reagan presumption that government investment is non-productive. Investing in any kind of services is unproductive. What we need is private enterprise. Because the World Bank concluded that there is an advantage in investing in human versus physical capital. In fact, there's a return on investment in education and health that is higher than capital investments often in the third world. And of course, this makes sense when we think about it, that the kind of government investments in education and health are what an underdeveloped country would need to begin on the path. Now, another tenet in the Reagan dogma, which continues today, is this idea that we must support the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the private entrepreneurs. And I was struck again by, I couldn't say this better than someone who was interviewed by our Food First staff in Honduras, who had served as a minister of labor in Guatemala and was reflecting on the Reagan presumption that simply we release any government-owned businesses, we release this to the magic of the market, and automatically there will be an economic improvement as private entrepreneurs take over. Guatemala Fonseca responded this way. He said, "The idea is nutty. They're touting it as if they've discovered something new. What do you think has been the dominant system here for the past century? How do you think we got into the mess we're in to begin with? There's nothing more inefficient and corrupt in Honduras than private enterprise. They steal millions of dollars every year from the government, from the people. Now we're supposed to sell off our public enterprise at rock-bottom prices to the thieves and mafiosos who suck the government corporations dry to begin with." The man obviously was a little hot under the collar. But again, it is not being, I will get to this in a minute, it's not whether I am anti-market or pro-market, that is not my point. It's simply taking a critical stance toward any simplistic formula, and certainly the formula that in and of itself, that simply turning away from government toward market forces is going to solve the problem of hunger. The critical fallacy then underlying this is the Washington assumption that what we must be about is stimulating entrepreneurship in the third world. Well, we think that it's somewhat of a reverse. I assume that wherever there are opportunities, that entrepreneurs spring up. The problem is that in so much of the third world, what's missing are the customers. So that the entrepreneurs, yes, that we would be supporting in foreign aid policies, the entrepreneurs, what would they do? If there is no local market, they will then continue to compound the practice of investing in things that are largely for export markets, not to develop the society in which they are living. So the problem then, the basic fallacy then with the simplistic embrace of the market is that, and the idea that we would be fomenting entrepreneurship in the third world, is that there's no problem in entrepreneurship springing forth where there are customers. But what makes customers? What makes customers is people having access to resources, to income, to be able to spend their money in the marketplace, to become customers. And that involves things like land reform, that involves real taxation, so that, and it involves keeping capital from fleeing the country. It involves a very, very difficult issues that the United States has been unwilling, in fact, when these issues are put forth, are pushed in a country, traditionally the United States has said no, that this is not acceptable. We cannot in any way encourage land reform. This is unacceptable interference into the society abroad that we cannot tolerate. We cannot be involved in. It is unthinkable. Now, what happens then, as I said, when we are looking at the diagnosis that we see in the newspapers, that we read about in articles, that interpret the world for us in simplistic formulae. And then we try to apply them to the real world, and it becomes clear why, in fact, hunger still exists. The easy diagnoses fail. So we're back again to square one. Now, my sense, having gone through this process that I've summarized, gone through this process over the last several decades, that I'm now taking you really through the last 10 years of my life. What I've finally concluded is that when the solutions that we come up with are fundamentally flawed, it means that we're not asking the right questions to begin with. So let's go back to the square one questions. What is hunger? And what is the solution? Now, during the late 70s and early 80s, I got pretty good at talking about hunger in very dramatic terms. In fact, I once interviewed the person in the United Nations in Rome, whose job it was to count hungry people. And I got to put these statistics in very dramatic terms. You've probably heard these estimates that the death toll from hunger is equivalent to a Hiroshima bomb going off every 2 days. And the more dramatic I got with my alarms going off, my dramatic comparisons trying to awaken people to the reality of hunger, the more dissatisfied I became. I began to feel that the way I was defining the problem was, of course, part of the reason that the solution, or the way I was describing the problem in the extent of it, was part of the reason that the solutions we were seeking were fallacious, based on fallacies. Because I began to see that if you think of people, hunger, in terms of numbers of people, then you will think of solutions in numbers of tons of food aid. So I began to think, how can I talk about hunger in a very, very different way? A way that each of us can imagine what it really is. What is hunger? What is hunger in terms of real people? And so I started thinking of it in terms of the people that I had met. What did they tell me about what hunger is? Well, I think of one family, Salvadoran family, who had lost 2 children in 1 year that they had given half of their crop, which was required of them every year, to the landlord. It was a year they didn't have enough to finish out to feed their children adequately, and they lost the 2 of their children. So every year then they had to make the same decision. Do I pay what the landlord is expecting from me, half my crop, or do I keep more of it so that I can feed my children but run the risk of losing the entire plot so that I can't feed my children into the future? Meeting them, I saw that hunger was anguish. It was the anguish of impossible choices, choices that no one should ever have to make. I remember Amanda Espinosa in southern Nicaragua. She was sitting, as chair, she was sitting on bags of beans that she and her cooperative had harvested, but she was telling me about her life during the Somoza years. And she had lost, as I recall, 5 children stillbirths, and 5 or so died at very young age, 1, 2, or 3. And she talked about these children that she had lost. And it became very clear then that hunger is also grief, the human emotion. I remember then walking into a home in the rural Philippines, and the first thing I heard was an apology for the poverty of the dwelling. And I thought, yes, hunger is also humiliation, because throughout the world people who are poor are made to blame themselves. And then I thought of Guatemala, where I visited in the late 70s, and I met 2 people who were working with World Neighbors, a group based in Oklahoma, and they were working to teach their neighbors better agricultural techniques, contour ditches to prevent some of the erosion on the very steep slopes to which they had been pushed. And the person who introduced me to these chaps visited my office a couple of years later and told me that one is now underground and one had been murdered. Their crime was teaching their neighbors more effective techniques of growing corn on the hillside so they wouldn't have to go down into the flat valley land and work on the plantations. This was a direct threat to those who wanted their cheap labor. This was a crime for which they had to go underground and one was killed. So I began then to think, what happens if I know that hunger is anguish, grief, humiliation, and fear? What does that tell me? Well, I think if each of us think about when we have experienced those emotions in our own lives, and we have certainly, hopefully, you have not experienced them in the intensity, perhaps, that these people have. But these emotions are those that we can imagine that we've experienced in some degree. When? When we have felt out of control. When we have felt unable to protect ourselves, unable to protect people we love. When we have felt powerless. So I began to see that hunger is the ultimate symbol of powerlessness. Now, that is the beginning. Hunger is the ultimate symbol of powerlessness. Then what is the solution? You can't give people power. What is the solution? I began to answer it in this way. If hunger is not caused by scarcity of food or resources, I began to think that it in fact is caused by a scarcity of democracy. I began to think of democracy as that which the processes of which people come together to share power, so that no human being is left outside the bounds of community to the point of powerlessness. Now, that began to raise a number of questions for me when I began to think that way, because then we are democracy here. We're the world's oldest democracy, and yet we come home, back here, what do we have? We have hunger. We have people stunted by poverty. A baby born in our nation's capital has less chance of making it to its first birthday than if born in Jamaica. We have 1 in every 4 of our children born into poverty, and they experience twice the rate of physical stunting of other children. And recent figures suggest that a male in Harlem has less chance of reaching old age than if he were born in Bangladesh. So it's square one. If I'm saying that democracy is that process in which human beings come together to share power, I'm suggesting that indeed where one finds it, whether it be in Iowa or in Manila, whether it be in Salvador or in South Africa, that as I'm moving toward this direction, it's suggesting that the promise of democracy has not been fulfilled. Now, the evidence is quite clear then. What I'm suggesting is that we need, if we are to address the roots of hunger, we need to start at this place. What is democracy? And what is its relationship to power? Power so fundamental, that primal power, power to provide one's needs and take care of one's offspring. Now, of course, here in our society, we conflate democracy and the institutions, don't we? We think of democracy, and when I think of it in the U.S., I think of buildings, of countervailing powers of government, and I think of the secret ballot, and I think of multiple parties. This is democracy, isn't it? It's a set of formal institutions that protects our rights. Now, when I'm thinking this way, I'm always reminded of a conversation I had with Julius Nyerere, this president of Tanzania for many years. And this was the late 70s, and he had been badgered by American journalists who were really on his case, saying that no matter how he talked about empowerment of Tanzanians, that in fact his was a totalitarian state because it was a one-party state, and by definition one party meant totalitarian. So Nyerere told me that he'd finally gotten fed up, and he turned to these American journalists and he said, "Come on," he said, "lay off." He said, "You in America, you have a one-party state too. It's just in your typical extravagant American style. You have to have 2 of them." My point is not to be against multiple parties. My point is simply that they do not guarantee democracy. A nun once in Guatemala told me that if number of political parties were the definition of democracy, that Guatemala would be the political capital, the democratic capital of the world. Well, I think Guatemala had about 17 parties at that time, and they probably represented about 2% of the population. So what I'm suggesting tonight is that as we've peeled away, I've attempted to peel away the layers, shifting my metaphor here from my scale. asking then, what is democracy? I'm suggesting tonight that it is not simply a set of formal institutions. In fact, many countries have beautiful papers, beautiful written descriptions of wonderful institutions of formal democracy, and yet the majority of people live in misery. I think of Central America, or I think of the Philippines. We're getting hungrier and hungrier. So what is democracy? My charge tonight is that it is a way of life built on working principles, the principle of shared power and responsibility, and accountability of the decision makers, the accountability to those who have to live with the decisions being made. Now, once we view democracy as a way of life, based on a set of working principles, then we see that it applies not simply logically, it seems to me, if we think of it in these terms as principles, then why do they simply apply in political life? Don't they apply throughout every domain, in work, in school, in community? Now, my claim tonight is quite a big claim. It's a simple one, but it's a big one. It is that unless we are about this work of transforming our vision, of transforming our understanding of democracy, our practice of democracy, in somewhere in this direction, that we simply cannot meet the challenges of the 21st century and those that we inherited from the 20th, including hunger on a global basis. I'm talking about the problems from global warming to failing schools, from rainforest destruction to drug epidemic. My thesis is this, that the solutions to these problems require, one, the active engagement of people most affected, the ingenuity that derives from the real-life experience of ordinary people, the commitment, three, the commitment of people who feel that they have a stake in the consequences, and four, the creativity that's only possible when diverse perspectives are heard. Now, the rub is that we have no vision of democracy that can tap all of this. Our vision of democracy is a static one that requires very little of us. There are glimmerings, but we have no vision. That's what we must be about actively constructing. Now, when I say that, I'm reminded of meeting Coleman McCarthy, the columnist for the Washington Post, and he said to me, I don't know if you know his writing, but he's very much a journalist activist. And he said, Frankie, the trouble with all good ideas is that they soon degenerate into hard work. So, yes, taking my hat off to Coleman McCarthy's insight, let us begin this work. What does this mean? For each of us in our lives, what would it mean to see our primary responsibility as transforming democracy into a way of life of shared responsibility and the accountability of leadership? What would it mean? Now, in my own life, before I lay this out to suggest what we all might be doing, it has meant a major step for me. As of this month, I am leaving Food First, the organization I founded in 1975. And I'm starting a new organization. Food First will go on, and I hope thrive, and I'm sure that it will. It has a very, very important role to play, and I'm very proud of it. But what my heart tells me is that I must take the next step, and the organization that I'm co-founding is called the Institute for the Arts of Democracy. And our primary program we're calling Building Citizen Democracy. And the rest of my remarks will begin to suggest some of the direction of that work. Because, again, without redefining democracy, I believe that none of the critical issues that we are all concerned about can be addressed. So what are some of the elements that must be involved in this revisioning and repracticing of democracy, and how do we bring it about in the various aspects of our lives? Well, my first point is quite simple. Back when I was introducing you to people who taught me what hunger meant, I said that hunger was powerlessness, and therefore the end of hunger And the redefinition of democracy that can be part of ending hunger is about empowerment, and that nobody can do it for us. I'll just mention a couple of people here. I'm reminded of Bertha Gilkey, a woman, a very poor woman living in the housing projects in East St. Louis, who made up her mind one day that she was tired of the drugs in her housing project and the fear that she lived with, and she said, I'm going to change it. And all the professionals and her friends came, wait, you don't know what you're doing, you've got to talk to professional social workers and law enforcement officers, and she was interested in changing the schools as well, and you've got to talk to the personnel there. And she sat down, and the way she tells the story, she said, I thought about that for a minute, and then I realized it was the experts who got us into this mess in the first place. So the Bertha Gilkey response is something that I think each of us can incorporate into whatever problem we see our lives addressing. I also met recently Coretta McFerrin, a woman, another very poor woman. This person lives in Chicago. And she had 5 children. And her young daughter, she had taught to count and knew her letters by the age of 4. And she sent her off to the public kindergarten. And her little daughter came home in a few months, didn't know her numbers and didn't know her letters. She found that the public school in Chicago was a school of unlearning. Her daughter had lost ground in a few months.